Well, hello, everyone. Grace and peace to you from God who loves us so very much, from Jesus Christ, our elder brother, a great liberator, and the Spirit of God that wings us forward toward freedom. I am, on behalf of Methodist Theological School in Ohio, our president, President Jay Rundell, the faculty, the students, the staff, and all of those who are connected to us. I am happy to invite you to be with us and to welcome you into the space. You will hear more about the lecture series itself in a moment from our Associate Dean, Dr. Yvonne Zimmerman. But in the meantime, I want to invite you that if you want to see the words as they're going, that you can click on live transcript, should be to your right on Zoom, and show the subtitles so that you can see the words as they are going by if you need to do that. I also want to remind you that there will be a time for Q&A, but there will be no interrupting for Q&A. So if you have questions, you might want to jot them down. And after Dr. Floyd-Thomas's lecture, post your question in the Q&A on Zoom, and I will moderate those questions for Dr. Floyd-Thomas. All right, everybody, thank you again for coming. Dr. Zimmerman, would you help us now?
Good evening. The Williams Institute is a time-honored tradition at MTSO, bringing to campus speakers from many backgrounds, including theologians, ethicists, poets, biblical scholars, historians, pastoral psychologists, and Christian educators. The event includes 2 lectures as well as opportunity for extensive dialogue and community discussion. This lecture series began in 1981 to honor the late Dr. Ronald L. Williams, Professor of Theology from 1971 until his death in 1981. The list of past lecturers is long and impressive. I will not take the time to read the entire list because we'd be here for quite a while, but some of the names that I want to lift up to you as folks who have preceded Dr. Floyd-Thomas tonight are Ada Maria Asazi Diaz, James Cone, Beverly Harrison, Mercy Amba Odioye, Monica Coleman, Melanie Harris, Stacy Floyd-Thomas, and most recently, Pamela Lightsey. It is my honor this evening to introduce our guest lecturer, Juan M. Floyd-Thomas, who is the Associate Professor of African American Religious History at Vanderbilt Divinity School and Graduate Department of Religion. He holds a doctorate in history from the University of Pennsylvania, an MA in history from Temple University, and a bachelor's degree from Rutgers University. Among the emphases in Floyd-Thomas's teachings are the intersection of race, ethnicity, and religion in the United States, study of new and alternative religious movements, the varieties of African American religious experience, and African American churches and socio-political reform. He is the author of Liberating Black Church History, Making It Plain in 2014, The Origins of Black Humanism, Reverend Ethelrad Brown in the Unitarian Church in 2008, co-author with Stacy Floyd-Thomas, Stephen Ray Jr., Carol Duncan, and Lynn Westfield of Black Church Studies and Introduction, and with Stacy Floyd-Thomas and Mark Toulouse, The Altars Where We Worship, The Religious Significance of Popular Culture in the United States. He co-edited with Anthony Pinn, Religion in the Age of Obama, published in 2018, and Floyd-Thomas is currently working on a book about the history of African American religion in Harlem. The title of tonight's lecture is If You Are Silent About Your Pain, Radical Reckoning, Religious Reflection, and Redemptive Remembrance on the Tulsa Massacre 100 years later. Dr. Floyd-Thomas, we thank you for being with us this evening. We welcome you to MTSO, and we look forward to learning from you.
Good evening, everyone, and greetings from Nashville. I bring you glad tidings from Vanderbilt. First and foremost, I want to say thank you so much to Dean Valerie Bridgman, both for this invitation, this opportunity, even in the midst of her being busy about her womanist work. Dean Bridgman is not only a dear colleague who's garnered my respect and adoration for more years than I can possibly count, but also whose work as a leading womanist in church, academy, and society has been such a profound blessing in shaping countless souls around the globe, that I'm grateful that MTSO is the recipient of her many glorious gifts. I also want to express my gratitude to the entire MTSO community under the leadership of its president, Reverend Jay Rundell, as well as Dr. Yvonne Zimmerman, Dr. Liz Bauer, the donors and sponsors of this lectureship, and everyone else for making this lecture, or this series of lectures rather, a reality. Although I truly wished and hoped to be with you in person when I humbly accepted this invitation months ago, I'm both grateful and glad that I'm still able to enjoy the warmth of your hospitality through the strength of our modern technology. Well, as many of you all might be aware, this summer marked the 100th anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa Massacre. After all the time that has elapsed since then, there's finally, at last, a growing effort. It has materialized to urge local, state, and federal officials to do what should have been done oh so many years ago. Look to ways to repair, redress, restore, and possibly even redeem all the harm and loss suffered by the victims, the survivors, and the descendants of this tragic event who, whether consciously or not, are still feeling the dreadful impact and aftermath of the massacre even today. In recent years, when I think about the overarching theme of America at the Crossroads, a century of struggle from 1921 Tulsa Massacre to Black Lives Matter, this is a situation that's largely been shaped by bearing witness to the rise of a toxic and traumatizing political framework now being hailed as Trumpism. In light of this situation in which we currently find ourselves, my thoughts often drift back to a brief yet meaningful conversation I had more than a decade ago with the late historian and activist Vincent Harding. After delivering a conference paper focused on Black Christians bearing witness to the synergy between Nazi Germany and Jim and Jane Crow America during the early half of the 20th century, as a marker of a rising tide of global and genocidal manifestations of white supremacy. And let me state parenthetically that oddly enough, this subject has become more relevant right now than I would have ever imagined back then. Nevertheless, in an illuminating exchange immediately following the panel, Dr. Harding posed a typically simple yet searing question to me, namely, how do we teach people how to ask about the hard things, how to deal with those things that we would rather look away from? Quite frankly, I'm still wrestling with this query all these years later because, at least as I interpreted it, Dr. Harding was pressing the point that both crucial and critical thinking must be ever-present concerns in our scholarship, ministry, activism, citizenship, and yes, even our personhood. Yet, here we are at a particular and very peculiar moment in this space and time when, to quote the amazing young poet Amanda Gorman, we have seen a force that would rather shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. Towards that end, I'm confounded by how our nation has either forgotten or maybe even worse, never truly learned some of the most essential lessons about what it means to be a humane society. In large part, the theme for my contributions to this year's Williams Lecture Series, tonight and tomorrow, have been greatly informed by and indebted to the groundwork provided by what is called Crossroads Theology. Now, Crossroads Theology, as I understand and embrace it, serves as a branch of womanist theology best exemplified by some of the works of Kelly Brown Douglas, M. Sean Copeland, and others, as a way to bring into focus those perspectives and prospects with a blues slant, if you will, that have been largely excluded from the necessary theological reflections of church and society. By definition, womanist theologian Kelly Brown Douglas contends that, and I quote, "A Crossroads theology recognizes the crossroads as a space of infinite possibility. Such a theology views the crossroads not as an in-between or undefined space of various realms of reality and identity. Rather, it sees the crossroads as a stable and definite space that reflects the fullness of divine and human existence, wherein the place of connection, the intersect of identities, is a place of power." In this moment, I can invoke lyrics from one of my all-time favorite hymns by saying, at the cross where I first saw the light and the burden of my heart rolled away. It was there by faith I received my sight, and now I'm happy all the day. But it is equally important that as I aspire to lend some meaningful focus on the cross in both a literary and literal fashion over the course of the next 2 days, is important to remain forever cognizant, as the late James Cone reminds us, and I quote, "The cross as a locus of divine revelation is not good news for the powerful, for those who are comfortable with the ways things are, or for anyone whose understanding of religion is aligned with power." Having said all that, I'd like to proceed to my prepared remarks. On Sunday, October 20th, 2019, the first 10 minutes of the premiere episode of HBO's award-winning limited series, Watchmen, began with a scene that lent a new definition to the phrase shock and awe. That evening, while expecting to see a creatively updated reinterpretation inspired by the original Watchmen comic book series created by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons for DC Comics in the 1980s, countless viewers, and myself included, were utterly stunned to witness a somewhat relentless televisual recreation of Tulsa, Oklahoma's Black citizenry being gunned down in the streets by angry white vigilantes, Black businesses being looted and burned to the ground, and even being assaulted from the sky by unprecedented aerial attacks. In fact, so many members of the television audience were troubled and bothered and horrified by watching the scope and scale of the on-screen carnage that night. They hurriedly rushed to the Google search engine to find some variation of the phrase 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Since so many of these individuals had never heard mention of this horrific incident in their formal education, this desire to find out the validity and veracity of what the creators, cast, and crew of the television show were depicting in order to confirm whether or not this tragic event had even happened was a way to appease their cognitive dissonance. According to Google, the spontaneous and simultaneous fact-finding frenzy by millions of curious viewers grew to such a fever pitch that it almost overwhelmed the tech giant and nearly crashed the internet. Although some viewers were likely hoping and praying that the brutality and bloodshed they had just witnessed on television was merely fictional footage made up for the sake of the superhero television series, but unfortunately, the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 was an all too real incident in our history as a people and a nation that, sadly, has been hidden in plain sight. Now, more recently, some of you all may recall that during the earliest months of the COVID pandemic, the Trump re-election campaign was making rather ill-advised plans to stage its now infamous debacle of a so-called comeback rally in Tulsa on June 19th, 2020. According to then campaign manager Brad Parscale, the event was intended to cram upwards of 60,000 attendees, despite ever-increasing infections, hospitalizations, and deaths in Tulsa due to the highly communicable disease. Even more than the looming crisis of the political rally turning into a viral super spreader event, there were countless African Americans in Tulsa and nationwide who felt the selection of this specific date and location was an overt act of anti-Black racism on the part of Trump and the GOP in order to disrespect the historical significance of both Juneteenth and the Tulsa Massacre. In fact, Trump had to ask a Black Secret Service agent what all the fuss was about and to please explain the meaning of Juneteenth. Many of us know that that's a holiday marking the emancipation of formerly enslaved Black folks in Texas circa 1865. While the former president was undeterred by every warning from local government officials, public health experts, and civil rights leaders, it was ultimately legions of teenage K-pop music fans and TikTok users who undermined the event. In the meantime, right, as they were able to execute a plan that secured potentially hundreds of thousands of tickets for Mr. Trump's campaign rally, they did so as a huge prank to crash the event. Although the twice impeached former president was probably as woefully ignorant about the 1921 Tulsa Massacre and Juneteenth as he was about the status of Korean pop stars BTS and TikTok as a wildly popular social media app, he did, in characteristic and inevitable fashion, try to turn this humiliating blunder into a hubristic bluster. And I quote, "I did something good. I made Juneteenth very famous," former President Trump told the Wall Street Journal. "It's actually an important event, an important time, but nobody had ever heard of it." Somehow, the man who once proclaimed himself to be the, quote, least racist person you know, was proudly claiming to have brought new attention to the largely overlooked African-American Day of Independence, while also trespassing on the hallowed ground of what the Oklahoma Historical Society declares, quote, the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. In the time that I have, I'd like to discuss for our discussion tonight, the historiography rather than the history that brings into focus the 1921 massacre. By looking at the what of the historical narrative, but also thinking about the how and why the story is recorded and recalled or forgotten and overlooked in particular fashions is crucial to what we are preparing to deal with. I derived the title of this lecture from a remark in Zora Neale Hurston's classic novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, wherein she contends through the voice of the protagonist, Janie, if you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. Reflecting on the memories surrounding the commemoration of the Tulsa Massacre on this very particular and peculiar year sits squarely at the crosshairs of what the renowned novelist and folklorist was proposing in that statement. When confronted with a seemingly impossible set of challenges and immense changes brought forth by the events that have shaped our lives during this particular calendar year, even as we look back 100 years ago, also served as a spark for this lecture. Faced with the chaos and confusion that has weighed so heavily upon us in the last few years, I attempt to use my talents and training as a Black historian of American religion to try and make sense of the paradoxes of this particular era in order to discern meaning in the midst of so much mayhem and madness. So as I begin, I'd like to briefly address why it is important to recognize and hold regard for this broken chain of memory surrounding Tulsa in 1921 and the murderous events of that year. I go back to the 4th century and the writings of that North African theologian, St. Augustine of Hippo, in his work, his classic text, Confessions, wherein Augustine is making a claim that memory is one of the most important elements in our human constitution, in our human makeup. And one of the more, I think, interesting meditations on memory ever written, Augustine, in that work, refers to memory as, quote, the vast court, the treasury in the mind. Augustine would also go on to say that great is the power of memory, a fearful thing. Oh God, a deep and boundless manifoldness. And this is the mind, and this am I myself. Taken as a whole, in his writings, Augustine seems convinced that we are our memories. They dictate to us, we respond to them, and we endlessly revise them. Memory can control us, overwhelm us, poison us, but it can also save us from utter confusion, loneliness, and despair. Now, if we were to leap forward a few millennia, just a couple thousand years, we can arrive, I think, quite nicely and safely at the feet of the late, great Toni Morrison. And in her novel, Beloved, many of the characters are haunted by the physical torture, psychological torment, and psychic trauma of slavery. But despite that reality, despite what they had to live through, as they're trying to have a breakthrough rather than a breakdown, they're moving towards their new lives as freed people in a post-Civil War America, seeking hope, peace, and harmony. As two of the key characters in the book, Paul D. and Setha are in a dialogue with one another as they re-encounter one another years after their emancipation and try to reconnect. In a narrow sense, Morrison brings into existence a new term, a neologism, if you will, rememory. And taking at face value, rememory can refer to a traumatic memory, but when, as survivors of stressful and hurtful situations, Paul D. and Setha are talking to one another, and Paul D. says, "Me and you, we got more yesterday than anybody. We need some kind of tomorrow." As Morrison portrays in that passage, human memory is sometimes that burden we can neither live comfortably with nor without. Now, having said all this, in the midst of going through this particular moment of overlapping crises, both nationally and globally, is causing me as a religious historian to rethink the narratives we've inherited in ways that need to be thoroughly interrogated as well as interpreted. I can openly and honestly admit that there is a lot occurring in our present era that is compelling me to challenge and change my own historical research and writing. My goal here, both in specific relationship to discussing the Tulsa Massacre tonight, but also more broadly, is an attempt to contextualize and confront our current experience in the wake of the last year and a half, wherein we've had to deal with a global pandemic, political upheaval, racial unrest, economic instability, ecological disasters, and the bloody yet inconclusive end of a global conflict, in order to ask probably the most pressing of questions. What insights have we learned since the Tulsa Massacre of 1921? Although separated by the span of a century, the global shift towards right-wing authoritarianism that we are seeing, that has become more prominent dating back to 1921 and is still threatening to resurface even here and now in 2021, is just one jarring similarity in how these 2 years in question serve as somewhat as bookends for one another. What is most fascinating to me is how many of the major events that mirror our own time have largely been lost or forgotten. For more than a decade prior to my arrival at VDS, I worked in history departments, and my specific teaching specialization at those institutions was early 20th century US history, especially the so-called interwar era, which helps explain my affection and affinity for discussing this time period, and the Tulsa Massacre falls squarely within it. What was particularly of concern for me diving back into those heady waters, however, was bearing witness to the general absence of the 1921 Tulsa Massacre from many historical textbooks, or theological resources that I once relied upon as bedrocks for my understanding of this broad narrative. And it is the larger sciences about such a devastating phenomenon that is oddly telling in this way. It's important to note that while there are numerous texts whose publication coincides with this centennial anniversary of the massacre, namely Scott Ellsworth's The Groundbreaking: An American City and Its Search for Justice, Daniel Isgrig's Pentecost in Tulsa, and Geraldine Eulenberg's Lynch Black Wall Street, chief among them, there still remains a profound dearth of scholarly books addressing and analyzing the hidden history surrounding Tulsa. To rectify some of that absence, I want to briefly recount the history before and during the Tulsa Massacre. By early 1921, a majority of the city's Black residents lived in the region north of the Frisco Railroad tracks in Tulsa, along the neighborhood's main thoroughfare, Greenwood Avenue. It was a largely Black-owned, self-contained, and self-sufficient commercial district that was also considered a safe haven. As co-founder of the NAACP and easily one of the greatest, most prolific intellectuals America has ever produced, W.B. Du Bois stated, quote, "I've never seen a colored community so highly organized as that of Tulsa. The colored people of Tulsa have accumulated property, have established stores and business organizations, and have made money in oil." While also documenting the rise of the Greenwood community as a thriving racial utopia within Tulsa's oil-rich boomtown, historian Scott Ellsworth described Greenwood as follows. The Black population had grown to almost 11,000, and the community counted 2 Black schools, Paul Laurence Dunbar and Booker T. Washington, 1 Black hospital, and 2 Black newspapers, the Tulsa Star and the Oklahoma Sun. Greenwood at the time had some 13 churches and 3 fraternal lodges, Masonic, Knights of Pythias, and the Independent Order of Oddfellows, plus 2 Black movie theaters and a Black public library. Along Detroit Avenue and certain other streets were the neat, sturdy homes of such Black Tulsans who owned businesses lining Greenwood Avenue, augmented by the houses of the city's Black professional class. Within this elite group, some were rumored to have assets in excess of $100,000. Yet, over a 24-hour period between May 31st and June 1st, 1921, a violent white multitude descended upon the deep Greenwood district of Tulsa, widely known as Black Wall Street, and burned it to the ground. It was later revealed that members of the vigilante mob had even been deputized and armed by city officials. On May 31st, at the start of the events, Tulsa police officers arrested a young Black man named Dick Rowland, who lived in the Greenwood area and earned a living by shining shoes, for allegedly assaulting a young white woman, Sarah Page, who was working as an elevator operator. While events still remain both unclear and unknown about what precisely happened during the brief encounter between the 2 teenagers, Page screamed when Rowland entered the elevator. Police were called and Rowland was arrested for, quote unquote, attacking Page. While later accounts say Rowland may have simply tripped and fell onto Page, the local gossip among white Tulsans accused Rowland of raping Page. While the evidence of any crime against Rowland was extremely weak, an afternoon edition of the Tulsa Tribune printed an inflammatory editorial calling for a lynching. As a result, a growing mob of white men converged outside the courthouse. With thoughts of protecting Rowland from lynching, members of the Black community also appeared, but were outnumbered, and after fights broke out, retreated to the city's Greenwood neighborhood, where most Black businesses and homes were located. The white mob followed, and the massacre began in full force, aided by members of the local Ku Klux Klan. Now, it must be noted that when news of the planned lynching eventually reached Greenwood, hundreds of community members, including many Black World War I veterans, armed themselves and went to the courthouse to protect Rowland from the lynch mob. It should also be noted that during this era, the lynching of Black people was a far too common phenomenon throughout the US, but especially within the area of Tulsa. During the era known as the Red Summer, there were 61 lynchings reported in 1919, 61 in 1920, and 57 in 1921. In the period from 1911 to 1921, during that decade, 23 Black Oklahomans were lynched by white mobs. As part of the Jim and Jane Crow South, Tulsa was highly segregated, its Black voters suppressed, and Black residents scapegoated. One might suspect that in addition to Southern notions of strange fruit hanging from Southern trees, this was also commingled with a sense of frontier justice that also lingered throughout much of the state. In Tulsa, a vigilante group calling themselves the Knights of Liberty had for years been ambushing and forcibly exiling anyone that they considered a radical. In 1920, a mob of hundreds of white Tulsans stormed the county courthouse to take a white prisoner into their hands. They lynched that man that night, facing almost no interference from the police and no charges. In the following days, Tulsa's police chief called that lynching, quote, of real benefit to Tulsa and the vicinity. So therefore, residents of Deep Greenwood, the Black community, regardless of their background, knew quite well the following fact. If the Tulsa Police Department was not going to protect white residents from lynching, no one was going to protect Black Tulsans. Therefore, it was with this full knowledge of the potential crisis that prompted Black war veterans and other concerned Greenwood residents to rally to the defense of Rowland's life at that crucial moment. Once, upon arriving at the courthouse, the sheriff told the Black defenders to leave the premises immediately. Respecting this request, after the Black men left, the white crowd outside the courthouse grew to well over 2,000, many of whom were armed. Despite the overwhelming show of force by these vigilantes, the Tulsa police made no effort to de-escalate the situation, disarm those gathered, or disperse the crowd. Later on, during that same night, the men from Greenwood returned, offering to help the sheriff protect Rowland. A fight broke out when a white man tried to disarm one of the Black veterans who was attempting to protect Rowland. Shooting and other related violence began to ensue at that point and lasted throughout the night. Early the next morning and throughout the entire day, a large mob estimated to number well over several thousand white men and boys attacked Greenwood, outnumbering its armed Black defenders by a ratio of roughly 20-1, if not more. Witnesses at the scene were reported to have said that they even saw people in airplanes fly over Deep Greenwood and engage in pitched battles with the local residents by dropping firebombs and shooting at people. So at the same time, we witnessed mobs on the ground who also drove through Greenwood, shooting randomly and killing Black people, looting and burning their homes, schools, hospitals, businesses, and churches. This all in the business and socioeconomic hub that Booker T. Washington had once proudly hailed the Black Wall Street of America. The official death toll at the time was a low number of 36, but more recent estimates say that as many as 300 may have been killed that night. It's also known that some 800 Black residents were treated for injuries and more than 6,000 Black citizens were displaced and interred at the city's convention hall and fairgrounds for up to 8 days. A prolonged gunfight had broken out as the Blacks withdrew from Greenwood and Archer. Block after block, the fighting continued into the wee morning hours. At one point, the battle raged around the train station, which was held as a fortress by Black defenders for an extended period of time as an escape route, but also potentially as a last stand. With the bodies of white attackers scattered throughout the streets, the Blacks retreated into Greenwood. This overnight fighting is usually ignored or skimmed over in the retelling of the story of the Tulsa quote unquote race riot. But what we have to emphasize here, and this is not in any kind of glorification of violence, but rather a recognition that far from being helpless victims, Tulsa's Black community did try to engage in self-defense and fought back as fearlessly as possible against these invaders, but they were greatly outnumbered and clearly outgunned. In an attempt, many African Americans fled from the community, but those who couldn't safely escape, many thousands were captured and held prisoner by the same attackers who were systematically burning their homes and community to the ground. Meanwhile, at best, Tulsa police took no action to prevent the massacre, and at worst, there are credible eyewitness reports indicating that there may have been police officers who were actively participating in the violent and subsequent chaos. At the end of the bloodbath, the white mob had destroyed 35 square blocks of Greenwood, burning down over 1,200 homes, at least 60 businesses, at least one of the schools, the hospital, the library, and well over a dozen churches. Only one remained relatively intact. Hundreds of residential homes that had not fallen prey to arson had been looted by the invaders. The former state rep, Don Ross, in a 2001 report, Tulsa Race Riot, a report by the Oklahoma Commission to Study the Race Riot of 1921, states the case simply: vigilantes under the color of law destroyed the Black Wall Street of America. Some known victims were in unmarked graves in a city-owned cemetery, and others were hauled off to unknown places in full view of the National Guard. Bringing this to contemporary times, much like our current situation, I'm inclined now more than ever before to imagine that the psychological toll of such events as the First World War and the Great Flu pandemic of 1918 might have lent themselves in significant ways to the more brazen acts of murder and belligerent massacres that emerged by racist white marauders during the heart of what's known as the Long Red Summer of 1919 to 1922. Within white supremacy, and please understand that I'm not conflating or confusing that with whiteness in any overtly reductive or general manner. I'm talking about white supremacy. Within white supremacy, there is a core of evil so wicked, so wretched, so wanton, and so warped that is downright jealous of any force on this planet that can have as devastating an impact on human life that outweighs the work of white supremacy in and of itself. As we look around in our own day and time, and when we're confronted by the likes of Fox News primetime commentators like Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham, who night after night are ranting, and it bears very strong echoes of the racist screeds that gave way to and gave life to the kind of thinking and being and action that prompted the Red Summer of the 19-teens and 1920s, which paved the way for, among other things, the rise of the second arrival of the Ku Klux Klan and nativistic immigration restrictions at home and much worse abroad. For a moment, I'd like us to consider briefly the writings of one Madison Grant, who in 1916, his book, The Passing of the Great Race, complained about unwanted demographic changes in terms that are strikingly similar to much of what we're hearing in various corners of America's right today. Older Americans from the quote unquote Nordic race, Grant warned, were increasingly being displaced by newer immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, Grant complained, weren't reproducing at rates fast enough to keep up with the Slavic, the Italian, the Syrian, and the Jew. Suicidal ethics is, and I'm quoting here, was permitted this unwanted immigration, which was already, quote, exterminating the old American stock in Grant's view. Another author, Lothrop Stoddard, wrote in 1920 a book known as The Rising Tide of Color, The Threat Against White World Supremacy. That's literally the title. Stoddard warned that the white races were being engulfed by the more fertile colored races. Another writer by the name of Kenneth Roberts wrote in the Saturday Evening Post during this period where a warning that the arrival of Polish Jews who were coming into America were, and I quote, human parasites. This kind of rhetoric, this kind of perspective about racial diversity and immigration was highly toxic, highly pejorative, but it also was finding its way into state and federal legislation. Unrestricted immigration, the argument goes, would create, quote, a hybrid race of people as worthless and futile as the good-for-nothing mongrels of Central America and Southern Europe, end quote. As historian Kevin Cruz has observed, the Ku Klux Klan used this popular panic over immigration to revive itself as a national organization in the 1970s, and was even making its way towards gaining legitimacy as a political party, especially at the state, county, and local levels. As a matter of fact, in Oklahoma, Democrats had succumbed to an intra-party civil war as the anti-Klan Democratic governor of the time faced off against the pro-Klan legislature. In 1922, the Klan's imperial wizard warned about, and I'm quoting, the tremendous influx of foreign immigration tutored in alien dogmas and alien creeds, slowly pushing the native-born white American population into the center of the country, there to be ultimately overwhelmed and smothered. So in the end, Oklahoma's governor was recalled and forced out of office. This internecine fighting and power struggle was replicated in the larger Democratic Party of the time, which was forced to confront the KKK ultimately at the 1924 convention with a proposal to condemn the Klan by name. That proposal failed, but the final vote was relatively close. 542 votes against and 541 votes for. In 1923, a meeting of Grand Dragons of the Klan focused a great deal on the supposed demographic threat that new immigration, as well as rising numbers of African Americans due to the Great Migration, posed to old stock Americans and the need to crack down on it. The popular panic over immigration and the pseudo-scientific justifications for anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism, and overall xenophobic nativism came together in the push for the National Origins Act of 1924, a measure that dramatically reduced immigration from Southeast Europe and banned Asians and Africans from immigrating entirely. This also contributed to an isolationist US foreign policy that contributed quite significantly to the unfettered rise of anti-democratic regimes across the globe in the 1920s and 1930s, most notably Nazism in Germany and fascism in Italy. Meanwhile, in the face of what was taking place both here in the United States and abroad, Black people were quite understandably wanting to look away both then and now from the grisly details and horrific nature of the Tulsa Massacre, because it's a painful reminder of everything bad about America in their lives. White people, on the other hand, it could be argued, use the ensuing conspiracy of silence as their own excuse to look away also. When it comes to white supremacist terror, definitive innocence is impossible and deliberate ignorance is inexcusable. Arguably, it is this dual trap of definitive innocence and deliberate ignorance that prompts so many whites to react defensively and deny vehemently any complicity with the systemic devastation of Black humanity that has recently been summarized in the simple, straightforward slogan, Black Lives Matter. In a world that plots and perpetrates the demise of Black life, Me and all other people of African descent who managed to survive and thrive in this world are the results and recipients of our ancestors' prayers and perseverance. In light of that, as historian Scott Ellsworth once noted, Tulsa at the height of its boom years was awash in oil and churches. More recently, Daniel Isgrig's book, Pentecost in Tulsa, explores the history of Black Pentecostal churches before and after the 1921 Race Massacre. Even as Isgrig extols Tulsa as an important epicenter of Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity in the United States, I will say it's commendable that Isgrig acknowledges the racist bifurcation that resulted from racial segregation that has led to the obscuring of his own traditions' Black roots, both locally and nationally. In its earliest days, emerging from the Azusa Street missions, Black Pentecostal revivals in Greenwood helped establish important churches there. Later, well-known efforts launched worldwide ministries from Tulsa that impacted millions of believers around the globe. Yet, even as he describes the untold story of a resilient Black Pentecostal community that suffered mightily during the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, his narrative seems more geared on a triumphalist outcome, hurrying towards a happy ending focused on reconciliation, rather than wrestling with a bit more of the moral failures at stake among the white Pentecostals and other Christians for their possible sins either of commission or omission. While he can recognize the racial ethnic discrimination that led to the erasure of Black Pentecostals from the church's broader history, it is apparent that he is much less willing to condemn the religious ethical disparities of white Pentecostals and other similar Christians that contributed to the near eradication of Tulsa's Black community. In order to plumb the depths of the tragedy and trauma of the Tulsa Massacre as it has twisted and tainted the existence of white and Black Tulsans alike, I would have wished Isgrig had possibly taken seriously the painful yet poignant challenges advanced by the likes of Robert P. Jones in his recent book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, in which Jones is asking his fellow white Christians to make a harsh yet honest reevaluation of their identity, history, and faith in recognition of a complex and complicit past infused with white supremacy. So, while Isgrig does get kudos for at least acknowledging the tragedy, I am concerned that in his attempt to hurriedly move past it in order to amplify a triumphal narrative of Black resiliency in the wake of the 1921 massacre, this work needs to be more critically self-aware in its reflection, such as I've suggested in the manner that Jones achieves, in which all white Christian denominations, from the mainline to the more marginal, would at least recognize, if not outright reckon with, their own failures in both a historic and contemporary sense to grapple with how their complicity with racism and violence had enmeshed themselves into their vision of church and state. Put more bluntly, Isgrig is more invested in the beautiful possibility of tongues of fire raining down upon Tulsa from the Holy Spirit, so much so that he ignored the brutal reality of bullets and firebombs raining down on Black Wall Street from the hands of fellow white Christians. As I move to a close, I want to bring into this conversation the remarks of none other than James Baldwin, who in his classic text, No Name in the Street, contends, and I quote, "Well, if one really wishes to know how justice is administered in a country, one does not question the policemen, the lawyers, the judges, or the protected members of the middle class. One goes to the unprotected, those precisely who need the law's protection most, and listens to their testimony. Ask any Mexican, any Puerto Rican, any Black person, any poor person, ask the wretched how they fare in the halls of justice, and then you will know not whether or not the country is just, but whether or not it has any love for justice or any concept of it. It is certain in any case that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. As is speaking over the span of the century that divided 1921 and 2021, Baldwin is asking us, and in some instances even challenging us, to hear the stories of people, particularly those who are most often disinherited, displaced, and despised, in order to step into their experience and learn about what true justice might possibly be in the United States. Our wellness as a nation, as a people, as a church, as a world, one that upholds the ideals of justice, is contingent on the wellness of individuals and institutions alike, who rarely, if ever, experience equal justice in this world. If you are powerful, Baldwin suggests, you do not necessarily have to pay attention to other voices. You do not necessarily have to remove the ignorance from your own view of the world. You can elect and choose to see whatever you want to see and avert your gaze from those things that are unpleasant, that you don't want to look at or experience. Unfortunately, for the vast majority of human beings on this planet, this is not an option. For people of color, for the poor, for most women, for most LGBTQ plus folk, for those who face neurodivergence and other physical differences and challenges. We don't get to look away. We don't get to avert our eyes or try to imagine what isn't as if it was and what wasn't as though it always is. Langston Hughes once wrote that we Black folk are wise to the metaphor of justice being blind. By maintaining power coupled with ignorance, something that emerges from this proposition is the possibility that listening to the perspectives of the unprotected, of the unwelcome, is often what is necessary in order to eradicate that most ferocious enemy justice can possibly have. To once again return to the quote that led off my paper, if you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and then say that you enjoyed it. What I'm calling for in this instance is a conversation that wrestles with, at least what I would suggest is a disruptive reverence for that which is just in the world. This disruptive reverence that I'm talking about symbolizes the urgent need to take seriously within our religious experiences and expressions the realities of the least of these in ways that appreciate rather than appropriate them, in order to recognize and reckon with what is desirable, but also those dire aspects of human existence in all its perfect imperfections as a matter of understanding our state of being in this world. So as I close, here we sit in 1921. Now, thanks to HBO TV shows, the media frenzy that accompanied former President Donald Trump's failed Tulsa comeback rally. In so many ways, we are now learning more about the Tulsa Massacre than we ever knew before. And yet, the massacre's devastating toll in terms of lives lost and devastating damage in various ways can never fully be understood or comprehended, and more importantly, might never ever still be fully repaired. Following the massacre, the loss in faith in government and in one's fellow citizens, as well as the devastating loss of so many businesses, so many dimensions of what was once considered civil society. The city, the state, the nation failed to invest and rebuild in the once thriving Greenwood community. But even worse, as we would witness over the course of several decades, actively blocked any efforts to do so, to actually reinvest and rebuild the community to its once hallowed grandeur. As I'll discuss in my lecture tomorrow, we have to wrestle with and recognize that no one still to this day has ever been held fully responsible or accountable for these crimes, the impacts of which still affect not just Black Tulsans, but all Americans to this very day. The efforts to secure justice in the courts, but also the work that must be done in our houses of worship have failed, not just due to a statute of limitations, but due to a lack of sheer will. Also, what we're witnessing and what we'll discuss in tomorrow's lecture, ongoing levels of racial segregation, discriminatory practices and policies, implicit bias and systemic racism have left many Black Tulsans, particularly those who still reside in North Tulsa, with a lower quality of life and fewer opportunities than many of their ancestors before them. The work of this lecture tonight, but also the challenge I put before many of you all who are viewing this, is that we must end the conspiracy of silence that made it possible for countless Americans to not know about the bloodshed and the devastation that happened 100 years ago in North Tulsa. More importantly, both then and now, we need to challenge and bring to an end the permission structure that allows for such terrorism and tyranny to prevail in a nation that prides itself on being the land of the free and the home of the brave. So once again, I remind you, one and all, that if you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and then say that you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Oh, my. Professor Floyd-Thomas, let me just say a lot of stuff is running through my head because that's what good lectures do for you. This has been a painful recounting of a history we like to bury. And I know that, I know just from reading that you have really spent some time with this. I'm struck by a couple of things that I'd like you to say a little bit more about. I want you to speak about, you know, it's been 100 years, the conspiracy of silence in churches, because Tulsa, as you pointed out, was and still is awash in oil and churches. I mean, Azusa Street Church was there. I mean, there's so many huge mega churches. I was in Tulsa over the years, not just recently. So can you say a little bit more about this conspiracy of silence? What do you think religiously fuels that? And then I have another question for you. And I want to remind people while you're answering that, if they have questions, to put it in the Q&A.
Okay. Thank you, Dean Bridgman. Yes, I can honestly admit, you know, these, you know, going through this history, dealing with these details and the events can be a harrowing and heartbreaking experience. But once again, and this is something I often tell my students, right, that we owe this in honor of the ancestors, in honor of those who came before us, right? We do not have the luxury or the privilege to look away or to erase what they went through. We have to rescue, recover, redeem, what they've gone through. And what, to your question, it occurs here with this kind of split screen experience, right? You know, it's been often said, I'm not the first to talk about life in two Americas, right? This notion that, right, that we're operating in parallel universes when, especially when we're dealing with race and racism, you know, just as two concerns that are obviously connected, but they're not synonymous, right? You know, you can have race, but you don't have to have racism, right? Okay, let's just put that out there on the table. I think within the world of church, right, there's first, I want to borrow from a dear brother, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, right, in this notion of cheap grace, right, you know, in The Cost of Discipleship, talks about the idea that, you know, we colloquially refer to this as forgive and forget, right? That supposedly, if I say I forgive you, that washes away all bad feelings, that, you know, you're supposed to just let it go. What I find fascinating personally, though, is that within the capacity of our society, both in church and in the larger structure of our society, people of color, women, folks on the margins, you know, because of sexual identity and so forth, and class inequality, we're always told to let it slide, let it go. Can't you just drop it? Meanwhile, the folks who have been privileged and powerful in our culture and society, if anybody slights them in the least, right, we go to war, literally and figuratively, right? If you disrespect or somehow say a grumbling, mumbling word about why is it that we have to have bake sales or you know, Kickstarter pages to help pay for somebody's medical treatments or somebody's college education, right? You get branded a socialist or something other than a child of God, right? So there's this culture and this capacity within the church to be lopsided, and I'm saying this particularly about the mainline tradition, but there are some echoes and mirroring going on in Black churches as well, where deferring and defaulting to the powerful and the privileged rather than addressing the needs of the disadvantaged and the disinherited, as Howard Thurman would say. One other piece I'll just offer to this, and then hopefully we'll have some other folks raise questions and concerns. But it's, as I mentioned towards the tail end of my remarks, the desire to look away from atrocities or tragedies that are so great that they boggle the mind is built in, right? The human mind can only take in so much. I go back to, and talking about the events of 2020, the year that was. And I remember early on in the year when we saw this steady drumbeat of Black Lives Matters situations. First, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. Then by the time we got to the watershed moment of George Floyd's encounter, a lot of folks forgot that there was a case in New York City where a gentleman was almost lynched by police in Central Park, right? The steady drumbeat of that misery was so much to bear that I knew many folks who I know and love well who just wanted to shut it down, who wanted to put blinders on and look the other way and just say no more. But God had other plans. But in light of that, what happens when we don't build up the vocabulary or the necessary infrastructure within our churches, right, to be able to talk about and teach what is necessary to be anti-racist, what is necessary to be pro-human, right, in this world, right? So that when events over the last century have happened, right, and we're seeing this now in increasing ways with many of our young people, Black Lives Matters being a prime example of that, who no longer trust or automatically go to the church as the first place to figure out how to mobilize or how to react, respond, and redeem Black humanity that's under threat, right? What we've seen now with this younger generation is, right, the church has to chase after and follow them rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
To this point, in looking at our white brothers and sisters, I wrestle with and I worry about the fact that they're struggling, and what is it Paul says in the epistle, that we stare through a glass darkly, right? That they're just now some are just now trying to come to some kind of critical consciousness and awareness about the devastating cost of whiteness to them. Not even talking about what it's done to the rest of us, right? They're now witnessing in real time how it's tearing them down, and they're not equipped. And so then once again, it falls back on people of color, folks of faith, who look like you and me, to now try to educate our peers, our colleagues, even strangers about the consequences of white supremacy, in this unchecked, unfettered fashion.
Yeah, I will say more about this after this next question, except to say that I really think part of what you have just said is what's behind the backlash against what people think they mean by critical race theory, which is actually what people are actually doing backlash to is not critical race theory, but American history. Mm-hmm. Told from the underside, and that's a whole nother thing. Yeah. The question here from Dr. Tajay Beulah, who's also a historian, thanks you for your lecture, and she wants to know, as we're talking about the recovery of the narrative of Tulsa, can you talk about why the word massacre is important to us and not riot when we are talking about what happened in 1921? And I would say from 1915 to 1922, but certainly as opposed to race riot that late, why is it important for us to name it as a massacre? Okay, and this is a great question. And even to your point, Madam Dean, we could extend the kind of broad narrative. I made mention of the Red Summer, right? This kind of bloody period James Weldon Johnson had named, which coincides with the Great Migration and the First World War. And yes, it circulates, and you start to see the kind of rumblings of it around 1915 thereabouts. But I think with the labeling of massacre, we can take this situation even further to the Colfax Massacre of 1868, immediately following the Civil War at the early phase of Reconstruction. And the reason why it's important to do this renaming is at least twofold. First, a riot, the word race riot had already a kind of weird connotation where, because of how it was used and misapplied throughout much of American history, to your earlier point, oftentimes, even if you didn't know the details, many people automatically assumed that the rioters in this race riot were often the Black folk, right? So there was usually this kind of mislabeling, misinterpretation wherein, oh, if it's a race riot, people of color must have been the driving force of the events, which was not the case, right? For those of us who are old enough to remember, commentary about, the uprisings of the 1960s, or even more recently, the 1992 LA uprisings, or once again, 2020 has an answer for us all, right? The events surrounding some of the protests that were happening in places like Minneapolis and elsewhere. Right. So riot is usually used in this kind of slapdash fashion that really doesn't equate to a kind of structural or systemic process or problem that's at hand, right? So even in my remarks tonight, I'm trying to work around this notion of the angry mob, right? Because going directly to the point about why massacre is more useful and important, right? There's intentionality with a
Massacre. The lethality that's involved in a massacre meant that Black folks in this instance were targeted. They were not accidental or incidental. They were intentional victims of the brutality of the extermination that was happening in the streets of Greenwood. So, you know, I want to avoid being long-winded, but Riot, at least in its suggestion, both connotes a misreading of who the perpetrators of the violence and the criminality were, you know, right, assumes Blacks when it was really whites, but also I think in a kind of commonplace fashion, also ascribes a kind of randomness or a lawlessness that just was born of chaos. No, when you got airplanes, right, there wasn't even a US Air Force at this moment in our nation's history, but you can organize and hand out weapons and explosive devices to folks who are flying planes over.
And deputize people.
That's not an accident, or that's not a coincidence, right? That's intentional. That's both systemic and systematic. That's why massacre is more meaningful in this conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The next question here is from Dr. Cal Brooks, who teaches homiletics and in our African American Studies portion of our curriculum. Thank you for your lecture. Your talk brings to mind Houston J. Baker's notion of critical memory. It seems popular cultural artifacts such as Watchmen, which I was going to ask you about this, and others try to shoulder some of the burden of the ethical evaluation of the not so long past through dramatization. I'm wondering if these accounts might be a double-edged sword, you know, the kind of making of them an artistic blend. I ask because of the ways the heightening of awareness in a vague way may obscure how we yet live in the reverberation of those events. I just, maybe this isn't what Dr. Brooks means, but I will say, you know, the removing it onto what we say in theater, onto the fifth stage, you know, a wall between, what does that do to the very historical reality? You get the question.
And I appreciate it. Also, Dr. Brooks is a product of Vanderbilt, so want to recognize that and appreciate being in touch, at least virtually, if not in the really real. But the issue of artifacts is important, right? First of all, how we know any people, any civilization or culture under the sun is by what remains, right? That, you know, I got colleagues who, you know, can tell me about, you know, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or tell us about, you know, the lives and times of the ancient Greeks or the Sumerians or whatever, based on, like, you know, they found half a hairbrush or whatever, right? You know, you figure out who people are based on what they leave behind in certain ways. You know, I know for folks who visited the African continent, right, you know, there were folks who scoured, you know, from National Geographic Society or whatever, scoured, you know, from Egypt all the way down to, you know, South Africa, right? You know, got every ladder, every mask, every grass skirt, any, you know, any artifact that they could snatch up. And now you got to buy appointment or buy a expensive ticket to go to a museum or art gallery to see artifacts that were, you know, people's everyday daily objects, right? So what we might consider trash, other folks are taking away and treating as treasure, right? So that's one thing about an artifact. More importantly, and you understand this as an artist yourself, right? That the idea is sometimes in our art, we can express and explain things that raw data and you know, sober, you know, studied scholarship may not reveal to folks, right? Now I find it, as we'll discuss on tomorrow, I find it heartbreaking and head scratching that HBO television shows like Watchmen or Lovecraft Country, right, can have these kind of vivid and I think very valid depictions of the 1921 Tulsa Massacre. Meanwhile, we are quite literally, maybe days, if not weeks away from the US Supreme Court still deliberating or arguing about whether any reparations had to be paid to the survivors, the still living survivors of the Tulsa Massacre, right? How is it that HBO is ready, willing, and able to do this kind of homework, but the members of the House and the Senate are still, up in the air about whether or not this should be addressed, right? So there are ways in which, and that's why I was trying to invoke, the writings of Toni Morrison, right, or James Baldwin or Zora Neale Hurston, right? There's a truth that needs to be told and addressed, and sometimes you can't go straight at it. Sometimes the more creative aspects or elements of our culture are necessary to at least help shape and inform our curiosity and our courage, right? So I'll say this, and I'll, please make room for more questions. For all the time that I studied, right, I know that my awareness of this incident, the massacre in North Tulsa, didn't come from my traditional formal education. I was listening to Public Enemy and other kind of quote unquote conscious hip hop in the 90s, and that's where at least the mention of Black Wall Street or the mention of what was happening dawned on me. So sometimes you have to go the long way around to get what you need, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I get both points here, the way people, but that goes to, I think the word you used was willful ignorance. That goes, people who can have these encounters, these kind of emotional encounters with history, and then quote factual, I'm not really trying to do this bifurcation, encounter with history, and still dismiss it from sort of the kinds of things that need to inform their ethical living, their religious foundations, the whole 9 yards. What you said about people saying, once you say, I'm sorry, then I should forgive and forget. I really, whether you're talking about the long red summers, which is a span of 4 or 5, even longer years, right? We don't really know. Or whether you're talking about something that happened. I'll tell you this quick story. When I was a little girl and went to church, went to a Pentecostal church, white church, with who was then my best friend, a blonde-haired, Nordic, blue-eyed girl. We had, and her family was told, how dare you bring that girl to our church? You did that to cause trouble. So again, Tulsa's Pentecostal roots, and the whole, we got the spirit, but also this embracing of a kind of theological anthropology that did not allow for our friendship. I think, I don't know if you're going to get to any of that tomorrow, but I do think that that's what is also at play here when you're asking people who know themselves as white, using whiteness as a theoretical lens, to take seriously the damage done here. Like it wanting to both distance themselves, kind of the way I think Dr. Brooks was talking about, and also not knowing what to do with the truth that's right in front of them. I'm going to go on to Reverend Rollins' question, and you can speak to what I just said and what she said, because I actually think these things are connected, which is, here you had the Tulsa Black community, Black Wall Street, trying to fight back, or at least trying to protect this young man from lynching, and they're outnumbered and outgunned. and then literally viciously destroyed. It's almost as if the powers were waiting for a reason to destroy them. And we could say this about Greenwood, we could say this about Rosewood, we could say this about however many Black communities that came out of Reconstruction. And this is probably at the nadir of Reconstruction, right? Well, how do those of us who believe in freedom, how do we keep going when, as Dr. Rollins is suggesting, there's a similarity in the fight where we're outnumbered and outgunned?
Okay. And I think that, first of all, you keep going because you have no choice to fall back. I mean, maybe it's something in maybe I'm getting in my old man ways or what have you, but, I was born in a situation where, there was no plan B. You barely had a plan A. So the issue is keep moving forward, right? Do not, if you don't hit the ground running, you hit the ground rotting was a particular statement in my neck of the woods. You keep moving because you have to, right? Much of what I was talking about privilege and luxury before is a kind of a deception wherein you think you have the opportunity, you should. Yes, everyone wants rest. Everyone wants peace. Everyone should want things to be kind of calm and copacetic. But, okay, in the real world, at least what I'm encountered, in the real world, right, there's always going to be some level of static or some level of discord and disagreement. Now, the issue is, what is the discord, the disagreement, the conflict, the tension that you can live with or reconcile and resolve? And what's the stuff that you need to leave alone, walk as far as the east is from the west, try to escape and avoid it at all costs, right? Some fights you shouldn't get into even if you can win, and some fights you can't get out of even though it's sure you're going to lose, right?
Yeah.
All right, so I'm just putting that out. That's some old man wisdom. Sorry for folks at home. But I think also, Dean, to your point, and I love what you're saying here, right? There's a sort of arrested development that happens within churches and theological spaces, right? Where folks try to default either intentionally or subconsciously to power, right? So many of the churches, especially the white churches in Tulsa, right? They got the word. I mean, it was fairly obvious, as we'll discuss more on tomorrow, it's fairly obvious the extent of devastation that happened in Tulsa. And how do you cover this up, right? How do you clean this up, right? Because Tulsa as a city, dripping in money, dripping in oil, right? At this point in time, wanted to be, the wealthy leaders of the town wanted to make Tulsa a player in the table of nations. This was a bad look. I'll just use contemporary language. This was a very bad look. So,
and that's an understatement, but keep going.
To put it mildly, is an understatement. But the issue was, just don't talk about it, right? Just don't talk about it, right? As I'll discuss on tomorrow, right? There was a systematic campaign by the police officers and many of the well-to-do folks in Tulsa to literally physically cut out pictures or stories of the massacre out of the newspapers of the time, right? Now, thankfully, some of these folks, they might have been wicked, but they weren't too wise. They didn't realize that even as the newspapers were being printed and delivered around town, that there were copies in other places, or that some of these had been photographed and saved to microfilm. So like, all right, okay, you cut up your neighbor's newspaper, but this is going to the Library of Congress, or this. Okay, so that's why and how we still have at least some paper trail of events. But meanwhile, you had wealthy donors, including one person whose last name might be familiar to many of us in theological education, J. Edgar Pugh, AKA Pew Foundation, right? Many of these wealthy oil business folk or whatever said, if we literally engaged in this conspiracy of silence, literally shut down any conversation or education about what happened in Tulsa, right? We can just move on, right? So once again, washing hands of a terrible and bloody incident. But I think the blood of the victims cries out from the ground.
Yeah, I do too.
Justice will have its day. I mean, and even now, as we'll discuss more on tomorrow, early, I think it was around February of 2020, moves have been made to, locate the mass graves in and around Tulsa of the victims, the fallen of the race massacre. Because of COVID and all the things related to the pandemic, much of that work had to stall or be put on hold. But it's happening, it's coming. And hopefully, if we who believe in freedom, right, we cannot rest. If we stay on our grind, right, that will enable and empower those who need to do the necessary dirty work of finding out who's responsible and how to bring justice. And that's all I'm asking for. That's all any of us should be hoping for, is justice for those who died that day or those days because of a lie.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of times I've heard students say, why do I need to know church history? Why do I need to know what does that got to do with ministry? I'm like, because we're living in the 1921 of it all right now, which is what you mentioned. It is a burden that we can't live with or without. Like, it really is that kind of burden. I'm going to make an observation that may make people feel bad, but I've gotten to be an old woman, and I don't seem to care about that as much as I used to. But I'm struck by the fact that we are having this conversation, and the conversation has been Black folk. I mean, the questions, and you and me, and I'm not making an assumption about why the non-Black people have not responded. I am just observing that I have not seen questions or comments from the non-Black people. And I wonder if this lecture has arrested people in such a way that they will return tomorrow and maybe do some Googling or whatever they got to do to learn more, not just about Tulsa, but the long red summer that is drenched in the blood of our people, and that people theologized about and gave themselves an excuse.
Yeah. As I was suggesting, it created a permission structure, right?
Yeah.
But also
that continues today.
Exactly. And to your point, I think that, as I was trying to allude to, the idea that it wasn't just this kind of street level violence and racism that was being played out. This was actually working its way through the political parties of this nation. It was actually working its way into immigration policy, right? You could see domestic social policy that was being directly impacted by this way of thinking, right? So, to borrow another phrase from another late great ancestor, Audre Lorde, your silence will not protect you, right?
Not.
Simply imagining that if you look the other way or stick your head in the ground, that these horrible laws will not impact you and yours, not so, right? The same kind of shady and crazy legislation that tried to bar the door against immigrants from all other parts of the world, from the 2/3 world or whatever, we're also making it possible for these massacres to happen here at home against anyone who's Black, who's Jewish, who is Catholic, who is poor, right? Who is Hispanic, queer, right? So yeah, silence will not protect you. Aversion and avoidance will not guarantee that you'll live to see another day. So
I am aware that we are at time, and I'm gonna honor that we are at time. And thank you again for this very provocative lecture, and what I imagine will make sleeping hard for some of us as you teach us how to ask about and learn about hard things. This has been very provocative and very necessary conversation for the MTSO community and beyond. And so I want to thank you. And I want to invite those of you who are on this conversation to join us at 1 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow, 12 Central, if you're Central, and figure out when you are, and invite other people to join you. It's free, but you do need to again make sure that you are registered for the lecture so that you get the Zoom link. Dr. Juan Floyd-Thomas, thank you so much, and good night, everybody.